But radio, all of a sudden, this was Roosevelt up close and personal. There's something else. Roosevelt came along. He was part of that first generation of politicians who could speak with electronic amplification, including over the radio, but also in auditoriums. Every generation before Roosevelt, from you pick your famous Greek orator Demosthenes to William Jennings Bryan, had been effective as a public figure, at least in part, for having a big voice, a stadium voice, a voice that was once described to me when I was on a book tour and doing a bunch of radio interviews, an AM voice. This in contrast to the FM voices. I did lots of interviews on FM, and I was, my host in this particular city said, now you're going to really like this guy, but I have to tell you, he's got an AM voice. And I had no idea what this person was telling me until I had been on the radio circuit for a while, and most of my interviews were on like public radio stations, which are FM. And it's in the nature of public radio for some reason that the hosts all speak rather softly. Whereas I met this guy, says, "How you doing? Great to see you." Ah, that's an AM voice. Well, the politicians all had to have AM voices, stadium voices, or as your preschool teacher would say, your outdoor voices. Let's try your indoor voice now. Roosevelt was a master of the indoor voice because he knew that he could speak directly into the microphone, and it would be as though he was just right next to you, and he could get his message across. And so partly it was his tone of voice, partly it was his understanding of how this new medium worked. He realized that when people listened to him, they became collaborators in the message. Because in the same way that reading a novel, as opposed to watching a movie, requires you to imagine the characters, whereas when you see the movie, there's nothing to imagine. It's all there in front of you. Likewise, radio requires you to imagine the person behind the voice. Television, there's nothing to imagine. The voice is all, the picture is all there. Oh, I'll digress briefly again. How many presidents have we had who were confined to a wheelchair? Who had an obvious physical disability? One, Franklin Roosevelt. Is this just coincidence? Was it Franklin Roosevelt's, what shall we say? Well, I would certainly hesitate to say that it's anybody's good luck to contract polio and become a paraplegic. But if you had to contract polio and become a paraplegic, was it Roosevelt's good luck for that to happen in the age of radio? I put it to you. Do you think that somebody could get elected president of the United States today from a wheelchair? I don't know the answer to this. And I can see arguments on both sides where, I don't know, we like somebody to project a strong image. On the other hand, one could say, boy, he or she's got a lot of grit to overcome this disability. Anyway, with Franklin Roosevelt on the radio, no one knew, no one cared, no one even thought about whether this guy had a disability or not. They couldn't see it. And all they could hear was the voice. And it's this magnificent radio voice. And I suppose if I were better adapted technologically at this point, I would play a clip of Roosevelt's voice for you. You'll have to take my word for it. But you can go on the internet, and you can hear it. But it wasn't just the voice, and it wasn't just his understanding that there were all these people huddled under the covers, listening to him, waiting for some reason to have hope. Roosevelt, in 14 and a half minutes, that's how long the first fireside chat lasted. The longest, I think, was 35 minutes. But this one was short, 14 and a half minutes. And in the 14 and a half minutes, Roosevelt explained the banking industry, how banking works. What I said just a moment ago, how banks borrow money on a short-term basis and they lend it out on a long-term basis, and how this leaves all of them potentially vulnerable to losses of confidence. He explained how the banking system had failed over the previous several months. He explained what Congress and the administration had done to alleviate the problem. He explained the timetable for opening the banks over the next 3 days. And then he came to the heart of his message. He said that everything that we have done in Washington, everything that my administration has done, everything Congress has done, will be for nothing without the support, without the confidence of you, the American people. Without your support, he said, we cannot succeed. With your support, we cannot fail. It was the most remarkable transformation in the public mindset that I can think of in American political history. For the previous several months, Americans had been pulling their money out of banks as fast as they could. The next morning when the banks began to open, people decided that they would vote their confidence in Roosevelt by putting their money back in the banks. And within a week, the banking crisis had been resolved. Now that's the banking crisis. And it was a remarkable piece of political work. It was a remarkable piece of political theater. Because Roosevelt had to play this role. He had to convey this sense of confidence. Did he really feel the confidence? Boy, if he did, he was probably crazy. But he had to act as though he did. Now, this is all. There's another aspect to Roosevelt in terms of acting the part. When I was writing my book, the title of the book is Traitor to His Class. But while I was working on the book, I had this other model in mind. I had another working title. And the working title was Command Performance. And I can talk about the command part, but the performance is what I want to emphasize here. I became convinced that Franklin Roosevelt succeeded in large part because he understood the performance aspect of the presidency. He understood that Americans expect something. They expect certain things out of their presidents. And if you can deliver those things effectively, then you have a chance to succeed. If you cannot, then you're doomed to fail. Now, if times are relatively placid and peaceful, your failure might not be particularly egregious. But in times of crisis, then you will get nowhere at all, and you'll get worse than nowhere. Herbert Hoover was one who didn't know how to play the role of the crisis presidency. He would have been a great president if he'd been elected in 1920 rather than in 1928. If the prosperity of the 20s had been on his watch, then I think he would be considered one of the near great presidents, up there with Theodore Roosevelt. He had all sorts of qualifications and experience. But it was his bad luck that the stock market crashed and the economy swooned while he was president. And he wasn't equipped to deal with it. Roosevelt understood that one of the things you have to do is convey this sense of confidence, whether you believe it or not. When Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, I'm not going to say he was exactly lying through his teeth, but any reasonable person would say, what do you mean the only thing we have to fear is fear itself? We've got lots of things to fear, starting with the collapse of the economy, the huge unemployment rate, and the rise of fascism overseas. There's lots to worry about. Roosevelt once had Orson Welles to the White House. Orson Welles, the Hollywood actor and director, the boy wonder of Hollywood. And Roosevelt took him aside and said, Orson, I hope you realize that you and I are the two finest actors in America. And I think that Roosevelt was perfectly sincere in this. Now, you might infer from that that means that Roosevelt was insincere when he was giving his speeches. What do you mean? It's just an act. No, no. It wasn't just an act. But in the same way that a violin virtuoso can be a brilliant musician, but also, if that musician is going to be effective before audiences, has to learn to be a performer